Welcome. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. It's really my pleasure today to welcome you all, and especially my pleasure to welcome our guest, Professor Adeeb Khalid. So this is the Peter Green Lecture on the Modern Middle East, and it also represents a collaboration between the Center for Middle East Studies here at Watson and the China Initiative. And I really want to thank my colleague, Shahzad Bashir, for his generosity and willingness to co-sponsor this event. And really, it was his initiative that brought Professor Khalid here. I'm so delighted that we have this opportunity. Let me just say a bit about our guest. Professor Adeeb Khalid is the Jane and Raphael Bernstein Professor of Asian Studies and History, and also the Director of Middle East Studies at Carleton College. Professor Khalid's work focuses on Central Asia, which of course lies at the intersection and is integrally part of Islamic culture and the Russian and Soviet worlds, and also, if I may say, the Chinese world too. Central Asia is this incredible intersection of cultures and civilizations and very complicated politics, as the title of today's talk, The Uyghurs' China Problem, or How We Got to the Political Re-Education Camps of Xinjiang, as the talk underscores. Professor Khalid is the author of 3 prize-winning books: Making Uzbekistan, Nation, Revolution, and Empire in the Early USSR, from Cornell University Press in 2015. The book Islam After Communism, Religion and Politics in Central Asia, from the University of California Press in 2007. And Professor Khalid's first book, The Politics of Muslim Cultural Reform, Jadidism, in Central Asia. Alas, my Chinese expertise isn't helping with all of the language necessary. And that book is from University of California in 1998. Without further ado, let me again thank Professor Khalid and welcome you to Brown. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very fine introduction. I hope I live up to the promise in my talk today. And thank you all for coming. The Uyghurs have a China problem. Since the autumn of 2016, the Chinese state has been putting large numbers of them, more than a tenth of the entire Uyghur population, Xinjiang, into political re-education camps for the purpose of cleansing their brains. This comes from official proclamations, and ridding them of harmful thoughts that seem to be the equivalent of Uyghur culture, it seems. A vast number of Uyghur intellectuals have disappeared into the, and not just intellectuals, media stars, members of the intelligentsia in general. The scale of the incarceration is astonishing. It has been well documented through efforts by people who have tracked the construction of these camps, through satellite imagery, through looking through tenders opened up by the Chinese government for the construction of these things, through changes in government spending and house budget outlays for security. Expenditures have markedly increased over the last three years. But it's not just that the camps are there, and the estimates for the number of inmates run from anywhere between 1 to 2 million people out of a total Uyghur population of 10 million. Outside the camps, Uyghur society is under siege. We have the makings of an amazing surveillance state of the kind we have. The controls, the surveillance encompass all aspects of Uyghur life and Uyghur culture. I was there this summer briefly for one of the strangest research trips of my life, a trip where I could not actually do any research. If I did, I would get my interlocutors into trouble, and I myself might have got They'd mostly observe and take pictures pretending to be a tourist. But this is a mosque in the northern Xinjiang city of Wulja, Yining. The front door has a large padlock on it. It's not, or it's been shut down, as have most mosques in Xinjiang been over the last 3 years. And there is a large red banner that exhorts people to actively bring on the mutual adaptation of religion and socialism. Here is the Idgah Mosque in Kashgar that in better times used to be sold as the biggest mosque in all of China. Now it has a red flag on it. It's still open, it still functions, but next to it, there's the red flag. And here is a people's security, convenience security checkpoint where people can, or they can also recharge their phones and get tea. But these police checkpoints litter the urban landscape of Xinjiang. There are places where every other street corner will have a cabin like that. There are police patrols, there are facial recognition cameras that are everywhere, and on top of that, there is a certain campaign of rectification of Uyghur culture, including its architectural rectification. In 2009, before this campaign began, the old city of Kashgar was basically bulldozed and then rebuilt because ostensibly the adobe structures in the old city were not safe enough in an earthquake-prone zone, so people are better off living in concrete and steel multi-story buildings than in these adobe houses. The old city was then rebuilt. The sign there says, it's in 3 languages, that what you're seeing there is a 1,000-year-old street. But it looks more like a strip mall a pedestrian mall in California or in Disneyland. And here is the world's newest medieval city gate. That is also a 5A national tourist attraction. So Xinjiang's culture has been sort of rendered into a tourist site for the gaze, mostly of Han-Chinese tourists. This is, I just could not resist taking a picture of this picture being taken, but this is, so the Xinjiang serves as the exotic and internal exotic for the Han-Chinese gaze. There are, this is, one of these is from the old city of, or the other from Urumqi, where again, traditional Uyghur culture is on display, but with the lanterns, the red lanterns that mark it as patriotically Chinese. Mosques are closed. If they're not closed, they have cameras on them. Those cameras are ubiquitous every 50 meters. And these are not just ordinary closed circuit surveillance cameras. They have facial recognition built into them. So Chinese citizens, pedestrians, but specifically Uyghurs can be tracked and all sorts. Here's another mosque with a red flag on it. This is from Kashgar's rebuilt old city. Some old mosques many of them have been demolished. This one was turned into an art gallery. And here's my favorite, this one into a bar, where one can knock back at one's leisure. So clearly the Uyghurs have a China problem. And in stating the issue this way, I'm quite deliberately trying to reframe an issue that is usually seen through a lens centered on China, that China has an Uyghur problem. Journalists trying to describe to their readers how the Uyghurs are distinct from the rest of the peoples of the People's Republic would say that, well, Uyghurs are actually closer to Central Asians than to other citizens of China. That is already to buy into the official framework of history as espoused by the People's Republic of China, that China's current boundaries are a reflection of some natural age-old unity, that China is a trans-historical entity that has existed across the millennia, and that all national groups living within its boundaries are Chinese in some way. China is a state where the government actually takes it on itself also to teach you history and to set down proper historical facts. That would be very nice and makes historians' job a lot easier, I suppose. But there have been a number of white paper documents that have laid out the official position on relationship to China. The most recent one was published in July of this year. And it basically states China is a unified multi-ethnic country, and the various ethnic groups in Xinjiang have long been part of the Chinese nation. Throughout its long history, Xinjiang's development has been closely related to that of China. It also says that there was never anything called East Turkestan, which is the term that was quite commonly used for this region up until at least the Second World War. Xinjiang, by the way, is a Chinese term that means new frontier or new dominion. And so it is new. Now, we'll come to where that newness comes from. The State Council also states that Xinjiang is a multinational, multi-religious space to which the Uyghurs have no special claim, and that Islam is neither an indigenous nor the sole belief system of the Uyghurs. So this assertion that China in its present boundaries is a trans-historical, everlasting entity is what leads us to believe that the Uyghurs are Chinese in some way. This has been a position that all Chinese governments over the last century and a bit have held, from the late Qing through the nationalists, through the PRC, that China is a single nation state with inviolable political boundaries. And that has to do with the late the Qings, concern with foreign encroachment, European and Japanese encroachment, and the unequal treaties that they had been forced to sign. And so the assertion there was that China is a single country. The Qing then were toppled in 1912, and the Chinese, basically the nationalist regime that succeeded them was faced with a choice that with a certain imperative that they were happy to see the Qing go. The Qing were, after all, Manchus, but they did not want to let go of the empire that the Qing had built. And therein lies the roots of the conflicts whose latest stage is being played out in Xinjiang right now. So let me pull back a little bit and say that as a historian of Central Asia, I would rather put the matter rather differently. The Uyghurs are not more similar to Central Asians than to other Chinese. They are Central Asians. They're Central Asians, those Central Asians who were conquered by a China-based empire in the 18th century. So here is, oops, yeah. Sorry, no, here. To derail my own talk. All right. So some of it depends on how you define Central Asia. So this is the continent of Eurasia. And at the center of it lies Central Asia, right? That's straightforward. But as that region, like most geographic regions, do not have necessarily a universally agreed upon definition. What we can say is that what is now Xinjiang and what is now post-Soviet Central Asia, the five stands, have been a single political and a single cultural and geopolitical region. And this map from the Chagatai Khanate from the 13th century might be reaching a bit far back, but that sort of does represent a certain cultural wholeness and a cultural unity that we still see. And that's what connects the Uyghurs to the rest of Central Asia. And I get to this because I was asked, and I foolishly accepted, write a general history of modern Central Asia for a broad audience. And in trying to imagine how I should define Central Asia, the map that I came up with is this. And here, Xinjiang and the five post-Soviet republics of Central Asia have a lot more in common. They have had much greater intertwined histories than they have with neighboring regions. This is how I define Central Asia for myself. And it was this region, or maybe this region, that was then divided up by neighboring land-based empires, those of the Russians from the north and those of the Qing, the east, over the course of the 18th and early 19th century. And this is why I have a problem when people say that Uyghurs are more like Central Asians. Well, it depends on how you define Uyghurs and how you define Central Asia, but the Uyghurs are Central Asians who were conquered by China. One of the things that one faces in writing about Central Asian history on this scale is exactly what China is. And according to the State Council of the People's Republic of China, in that white paper that I just quoted, China is the current boundaries of the PRC, and that represents some unity that has existed for at least 3,000 years. Well, if you look at the map, oh my God, I keep doing, sorry. All right. So this is an excellent GIF. I downloaded somewhere. I used it from a teaching. I can't remember where I got it from. My apologies to the copyright owners. But it does give you a sense of the moving boundaries of China-based empires and the amount of time that Xinjiang was part of any entity based in China. And those are not very large periods of time. And basically, it was the Qing dynasty, and then the Qing and then the PRC. Let's go back to this. That controlled Xinjiang, that made Xinjiang a part of a Chinese state. Xinjiang became most recently a part of a Chinese state through a series of conquests between 1755 and 1759, when the Qing Empire conquered. The Qing were Manchus, and they ran basically an inner Asian empire that was built on conquest, that recognized difference, treated its different subjects quite differently. They did not set out. They made Xinjiang part of the same state as the Chinese, but the Qing really did not have any interest in turning the inhabitants of Xinjiang into Chinese. They were different non-Manchu subjects of their empire, just as were the Han. So, and for much of the Qing rule over Xinjiang was troublesome. There were any number of revolts, and then Qing rule was overthrown in a massive revolt in 1864. Xinjiang was conquered a second time between 1879 and 1881. And even then, it was a huge space far away from the capitals. Central rule was very thin and very weak. And actually, after the 1880s, as a result of the unequal treaties granting extraterritorial rights to European subjects that the Qing had been forced to sign, Xinjiang was actually more closely tied to the Russian Empire and to Russian Central Asia than to mainland China. And after the Trans-Siberian Railway was completed in 1891, it was easier for Chinese officials appointed to Xinjiang to go to Vladivostok, take the train all the way to what is now Kazakhstan, and then re-enter Xinjiang that way. The Russian ruble was the most significant currency in the bazaars of Xinjiang, and Xinjiang trade, but also Xinjiang intellectuals were much more likely to look west to not to the Russians, but to the Muslim communities of the Russian Empire, and then farther afield to the Ottomans. And this is where, from the early 20th century, when new kinds of ideas and new kinds of education begin to arise and arrive in Xinjiang, a lot of it comes not from China, but from Russian Central Asia, from other Russian Muslim communities, such as those of the Tatars in present-day Tatarstan. Kazan was a major center of Muslim learning, and many of the let's see, in Gulja, where the White Mosque was, there was a number of Russian traders, most of whom happened to be Tatar Muslims, and that's where a lot of ideas of Muslim modernism began to arrive. And they came not from China, but from Muslim communities in the Russian Empire, and then farther afield from the Ottomans. The fact that the indigenous populations of Xinjiang, Uyghurs, and others are Turcophone, they speak Turkic languages that are mutually intelligible to those in Russian Central Asia, and with the Ottomans helped. And it was here that perhaps the most significant ideas that are significant for our purposes, those of nationhood, begin to arrive. And that was perhaps the most important was the idea of Turkism, that the people of Xinjiang shared a common Turkic ethnic origin with other Central Asians, other Turks, and Ottomans. This is not pan-Turkism, which is the idea that all Turkic peoples should unite, which has always been a pretty marginal idea. But Turkism, this recognition of ethnic origin, and that ethnic origin is significant to one's sense of self and one's political, and should be the basis of one's political community, that was absolutely central. And that means that Uyghur intellectual developments were tied to what was going on in Central Asia, in other Turkic countries, Russian Central Asia, Tatarstan, the Crimea, and the Ottomans. And in some ways, much more closely linked to that than anything that was happening. Once the Qing dynasty collapsed and China became a republic, then for Chinese thinkers, there was a question of how to conceptualize of the Chinese state. And here, there is a fundamental problem that they all faced, that was best expressed many decades later. This is a wonderful quote from Mao Zedong, that China is a big and rich country, but the population is Chinese, the size and the wealth and the natural resources are in territories that are not historically and ethnically. That is, in some way, a fundamental issue. And so this is 40 years later. The republic is gone. This is into the communist era, but the problem is still there. So initially, under Sun Yat-sen, the idea was to reimagine China as, to reimagine China as a union of 5 races or 5 nations. The 5 being the Han Chinese, the Manchus, the Mongols, the Tibetans, and interestingly, the Muslims, which was a race or a nation, but that included both the Hui, the Chinese-speaking Muslims, and the Turkic-speaking Muslims of Xinjiang. And this lasted, so this is the national flag of that republic. But that sort of fell by the wayside when China's fragmentation during the nationalist era and then the Japanese invasion later on made an emphasis on absolute essential unity much more significant to emphasize. Official rhetoric shifted for Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist leadership. Increasingly, there was this idea that all different ethnic groups in China are genetically and racially related to each side of China. The problematic position to take, but it was taken. The Chinese communists who were in the opposition and before they took power came up with something else, with a different way of conceptualizing diversity. And for that, a lot of those ideas came from the Soviet Union. Here we need to sort of take a step back and switch our focus to the what had been going on in the Russian Empire after the collapse of that empire in 1917. Because the former Russian Empire was put back together by the Bolsheviks, who then reconceptualized it as a federation of allegedly sovereign republics based on national self-determination of the various different nations inhabiting the former Russian Empire, who were granted territorial autonomy. So the Soviet Union was a union. It was a federal union, and conceptually at least, it was a union of territorially autonomous republics. Why did the Soviets do that? There's really no real basis in Marxism for that, but the Russian Revolution had seen massive national mobilization by all the non-Russian peoples of the Russian Empire, and for the Soviets, then this was a way of sort of co-opting some of the appeal of nationalism within a Soviet framework. And so you have the creation of all these national republics over the course of the 1920s, including in Central Asia. The neighbors, the Uyghurs' neighbors, all acquired these territorial republics. And a lot of this was built from the seat of the pants. The Soviets sort of came up with all these things as challenges presented themselves. But by the end of the 1930s, the basic formula of Soviet nationalities policies were in place. The Soviet Union was a socialist country built on the friendship of peoples who each enjoyed territorial autonomy, and they were ostensibly sovereign. The ostensibly is important here, but still. The Russians were conceptualized as their elder brothers, the most advanced people who are shepherding their younger siblings along the path of progress to the nirvana of classless society. But at the same time, the Soviet Union was never conceptualized as a Russian state. It was a multinational state built on a federation. The Russians were seen as elder brothers, but beyond that, they had no further claim on the ownership of the state. And then after the Second World War actually was a crucible that really made, with the common sacrifice and the common slaughter, allowed people to develop a sense of common Soviet patriotism. In the post-Stalin period, there was some sort of decentralization is too strong a word, but there was a devolution of power, and in each of these national republics, indigenous political elites came into power. They enjoyed a great deal of authority as long as they did not rock the boat, as long as they fulfilled the economic demands of the center, and the Soviet economy was hyper-centralized, but they enjoyed language rights and considerable cultural autonomy, but also their power over the allocation of resources. So these non-Russian political elites became a real reality in the years from the mid-50s on, especially. And which is one of the reasons why when the Soviet Union fell apart, there were these indigenous elites that could take over. And what happened in Central Asia is that these Muslim communist, Central Asian communist elites reinvented themselves as national leaders, and some of them are still there in power. So what does all of that have to do with the Uyghurs? First of all, the very idea of an Uyghur national identity was first dreamed up, first imagined, sorry, I'm sorry, I don't mean to say it's only a dream. All nations are imagined. The Uyghur nation was imagined in Soviet Central Asia in the early 1920s among the substantial Uyghur diaspora that had shown up in the Russian Empire through long-term labor migration, but also long-term population transfers and so on and so forth. But also that the fact that other Central Asians were acquiring territorial autonomy, having their new books published in their languages, language rights, and so on and so forth, became a model for emulation or an aspiration for Uyghur intellectuals. In the interwar period, Xinjiang continued to be much more closely linked to the Soviet Union than to the rest of China. This is as much because of the weakness of the Central Chinese state. Xinjiang was actually ruled between 1916 and 1943 by a succession of three Han-Chinese governors who ruled often with a tight fist, but with very little connection to China, to the capital. And sometimes they actively flouted China's commands, or Beijing's and Nanjing's commands. And the last of them, Sheng Shizai, actually took Xinjiang into a position almost of a satellite state with the Soviet Union. And among other things, he introduced a whole series of postulates from Soviet nationalities policies into Xinjiang. He wanted to make Xinjiang a model province for all of China by bringing about Soviet-style policies of managing national difference. He who then granted Uyghur began the use of the term Uyghur in Xinjiang itself, but granted language rights and so on and so forth. That period also, the interwar period also saw two attempts at creating Eastern Turkestan republics. either as completely independent of China or enjoying a much greater degree of autonomy within China than had ever been contemplated by any Chinese government. There were other people who worked within a Chinese framework without talking about the republic, but who also sought much greater degrees of autonomy, and that, which would mean language rights, control over resources, and so on and so forth. All of that fell by the wayside once the People's Republic was established, when the People's Liberation Army took Xinjiang. It was called the Peaceful Liberation of Xinjiang because the Kuomintang, the nationalist forces, surrendered. The PLA marched in, only to find that there was really no basis of support among the indigenous population on which a future Xinjiang, a future communist Xinjiang. At the same time, the PRC had adopted several aspects of Soviet nationalities policy. There was an ethnographic expedition that led to a census that recognized 55 non-Han nationalities or Minzu in China. And there was some structure of territorial autonomy that was implemented. And so there are certain similarities between Soviet and Chinese practices and Soviet and Chinese iconography of national difference within these states. Here is a Soviet poster from early 1950 with all the various peoples, nationalities of the Soviet Union pressing the joy together. Here's a Chinese poster. Here's a very famous Stalin. And here's a very famous poster of Mao leading all the various minority nationalities to joy and happiness. What you will notice in all of these, both in Soviet and in Chinese practice, the nationalities are sort of folklorized. They are minorities because they wear their funky costumes here and here and here. And that is very much with us in China today, where the non-Han nationalities have to be depicted. If they start wearing business suits and working in offices, then we don't know what to make of them, but it's much more easy to associate them with folkloric dress and folkloric culture and dance, especially for the Uyghurs. And this is a postcard that I own, that I scanned here, that has Uyghurs dance courtyard of a mosque, and that's how you express your cultural and your ethnic identity. All right. So there are these similarities. In some ways, you think that the Chinese, the PRC had borrowed Soviet practices of managing national difference, but there are some very fundamental differences. One is that the Soviets did talk about national self-determination. That proletarian national self-determination is expressed through these territorial republics. In practice, that might not have been the case, but in the PRC, that's not even a theoretical option. China remained a single state. Autonomy was very limited. China was never turned into a federation. And ultimately, the official title for Xinjiang is the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, but Uyghurs have no title to Xinjiang in the way that Uzbeks had to Uzbekistan or Kazakhs had to Kazakhstan. And finally, one way of integrating Xinjiang into China has been a planned policy of demographic transformation. And so here is a chart of how the percentage of Han and percentage of Uyghur populations has changed over time. In 1949, the Han population was about 6% of Xinjiang. By the late 1970s, it was up to over 40. There was a brief period when it fell, but since then it has picked up again. This is, to a certain extent, this is people just showing up to find jobs and betterment, but to a great extent, this is an actual plan. All right, so this obviously creates a great deal of unhappiness among studied in your own homeland. But before we get to that, let's talk about a couple of other more positive things. That there was a policy of language rights. There was officially sanctioned, officially sponsored, officially funded cultural, historical, ethnographic research. And from the 1950s, then the madness of the Cultural Revolution put paid to everything for about 15 years and picked up again in the late 1970s. And there you have the emergence of an Uyghur intelligentsia and modern Uyghur culture, where Uyghurs can begin to imagine not just their present, but their past, which is the same thing that had happened in Soviet Central Asia under official auspices. But here, there are two differences. First, there was no Uyghur political elite that emerged in the way that it had emerged in Soviet Central Asia. Uzbekistan by the 1980s was really run by Uzbeks. In Xinjiang, nothing like that happened. There are Uyghurs in the party, but in the 70 years since Xinjiang has been part of PRC, there were 5 years when the Xinjiang Committee of the Communist Party of China was headed by an Uyghur. All other times it's been run by Han Chinese. That was not at all the practice in the Soviet Union. The second was that Uyghurs kept running up against limits of expression about how they could imagine their history, and that could result in censorship, arrests, suspensions, firings, and so on and so forth. The biggest vehicle for an Uyghur national imaginary was the historical novel. Writing about the present is hard and politically fraught, but you can write about the past, nationalize the past. And from the mid-1980s, the historical novel became the major vehicle for the creation of an but there were limits. And then something else happened that, again, happened outside of Xinjiang as much as anything else. The Soviet Union fell apart. Mikhail Gorbachev started reforming the Soviet state, and it came crashing down, partly as a result of mobilization along the lines of the rights of the Union Republic. And the Soviet Union actually did not collapse, it dissolved. The legal act that ended the Soviet Union was the dissolution of the Union Treaty. And so it was less of a collapse than the unraveling of and that's why we have 15 republics that come out of the Soviet. For Chinese observers of Soviet reform, this whole thing was a complete catastrophe. Gorbachev was a fool, and Soviet policy had been all on the wrong track since Khrushchev. They had given, and so it was read in China, they had given their Minzus, their minorities, too much power, and look what they had done. They had destroyed the state. So from 1991, China's already pretty limited commitment to territorial autonomy and cultural pluralism began to shrink again. But at the same time, though, that China also began to open up, Uyghurs could travel more, as could all Chinese citizens. They're much more tied to the rest of the world, and they had the example of their Central Asian neighbors. And so there's been this process of Uyghur hopes rising, the Chinese state pushing back against them, Uyghur discontent rising, the Chinese state seeing that as a threat to stability. And so this back and forth has gone on. And it has resulted in a number of things. There is a great deal of that Xinjiang is in really a dual society in which the Han and the non-Han live side by side, but with rather limited interaction. Educated Uyghurs speak Chinese, no Han Chinese speak in any significant numbers. There are all sorts of everyday forms of resistance, and then occasionally it would break out in violence. Riots, mostly, that the Chinese state saw as a sign of separatism and disloyalty. And this was the story of the 1990s and the 2000s. There's a turning point in 2009 when there was a massive riot in Urumqi, the capital, that had nothing to do with separatism or with Islamic militancy. It was a protest against the fact that Han Chinese implicated in the murder of Uyghur workers in eastern China had not been punished. There was a massive protest organized against that then turned violent, and that took on an ethnic an ethnic character, and Uyghurs rampaged and destroyed Han Chinese businesses. They were put down. 2 days later, Han Chinese came out on the streets and started beating up Uyghurs. It was a massive, horrifying, violent episode. But it was about discontent in that fashion. The Chinese state's response was to blank out all internet for a year in Xinjiang and basically see that as a sign of separatism. And since about 2000, the language used has been the three evils of separatism, extremism, meaning Islamic extremism, and terrorism. And so co-opting the global post-9/11 discourses of anti-terrorism for this. So now, after 2009, all sorts of restrictions appeared. Another strike hard campaign began, and that begat more violence. In the next 5 years, saw quite a bit of violent episodes by Uyghurs in Xinjiang, a few times outside of Xinjiang as well. But nothing ever happened in 2016 when this current campaign of incarceration, political re-education began. And I think that has more to do with, has little to do with anything that happened in Xinjiang itself, and more to do with other priorities that the Chinese state has, which is its Belt and Road Initiative, which is this massively ambitious program to reshape Eurasia as an economic space, an expression of China's newfound status as a global power and an economic powerhouse. And if you look on the map, none of that is all premised on the notion that China controls Xinjiang properly. If that is an area of turbulence, then the whole thing falls apart. It's premised on the control of Xinjiang, and as there are all sorts of reasons to believe that the Chinese state decided in 2000 to solve its Uyghur problem once and for all. All right, so I will begin to wrap up, but I would say that this is how this fundamental tension between how Uyghurs see themselves and their relationship to Xinjiang, and how the Chinese state sees itself and its relationship to Xinjiang. That this fundamental dissonance is at the heart of this problem. That what has happened is that by 2016 or today, the Chinese state has acquired enormous resources that in previous decades would have been inconceivable. China's economy has grown more than 40-fold since the onset of the reform era, since the death of Mao. And that gives it an ability to control this vast and distant space that up until 1980, no Chinese state could even contemplate. And that, in some ways, is what defines the present moment. I'll just finish with a couple of thoughts. One is, like, where do we place the current campaign for incarceration? What kind of historical comparisons can we think of? People have argued that the notion of political re-education that can be traced back to Confucian ideals of the perfectibility of man, of humans. But there are also Marxist notions of reforging human beings through labor and overcoming false consciousness. Both Stalin and Mao had political re-education camps. Both had forced labor camps. The campaign today against mosques, the closure and destruction of mosques, and against intellectuals is eerily reminiscent of Soviet anti-religious campaigns of the late 1920s and 1930s. That's what I wrote about extensively in my last book. The difference here is that for the Soviets, there was the foot soldiers of a lot of those campaigns were Central Asians, and they were driven by the sense of creating a modern, rational society free of religion, of basically modernizing Kazakhs and Turkmens and Uzbeks, rather than what is going on here, which is much more about the Chinese state that is seeing Islam or Uyghur culture basically as a mental disease that stands in the way of their loyalty to China. And finally, there's one other episode that all Uyghurs are suspect. The only episode like that we can see in, say, Soviet Central Asian history are a series of deportations, usually of smaller national groups that Stalin carried out during, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, where whole national groups were accused of disloyalty and treason to the Soviet Union and to the Soviet fatherland, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, the Chechens, and deported to other parts of the Soviet Union. So that's the only other comparison I can find. But ultimately, the problem is the difference between the Soviet Central Asian case and the Chinese Central Asian case is that China is still seen as a unified multi-ethnic country, which fudges something. So what is a multi-ethnic Chinese culture? And for all intents and purposes, in all visual representations, it's really the same as Han Chinese culture. That China is very much a national state of the Chinese, and that the Chinese Communist Party has basically is exhibit A for the claim that all through the 20th century nationalism and communism went hand in hand. That for a lot of national groups, national movements, communism was the path to national salvation. The Chinese Communist Party has been a Chinese national party that sees communism as the best way of ridding China of all its problems and building a new China. And that rhetoric is very much there today. And in that sense, this is different. The Soviet Union was ethnically and nationally and culturally neutral. Soviet Union is the only country that has ever existed that had no geographic or ethnic dictator in its name. And in that sense, Sovietness meant modernity in progress, not an ethnic indicator. One could be Uzbek and Soviet at the same time, in a way that Uyghurs cannot be Uyghurs and Chinese at the same time. And finally, there's the difference in the demographic weight. The Russians, the highest percentage that the Russians ever composed of the Soviet population was 53%. The Han Chinese portion of the Chinese population is 93%. And there is that demographic weight makes all the difference. All right, I don't have any formal conclusions for this talk because I could not think of anything that would not be depressing. So I think I will just stop talking here. Thank you very much.